Thanks, Larry.
Okay, you ready? Well, it looks like a cathedral village in here. Many more people sitting on the left than on the right. Okay, welcome. Happy to see you back. We're going to switch from we're going to go to Algeria today, but before we do that, I'd like to review, as I usually do, some of the things we said last time. One of the things we talked about was this so-called Donatist heresy. It was very widespread in North Africa. This belief in early Christianity, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, that sacraments are good only if administered by a pure person. Well, that's a problem when if you begin to question priests and bishops. It could challenge the authenticity of the church. So it was eventually wiped out. I mean, St. Augustine wrote a bunch of articles over the years against the Donatists, because he also is from North Africa, I mention it because this is just the area where Islam moves in very quickly. So whether there's any connection with a weakness in Christianity or not, I don't know, but I found it interesting. We also talked about the Arab invasions starting in the 7th century, continuing in the 8th century, and massive conversions to Islam. And remember that Islam is not a monolith. There are various versions of jurisprudence, even though everyone is a Muslim. There are different attitudes toward life, and we'll see some of that. We also talked about the hope for a greater Morocco. Morocco, by the way, is the only country over there that has stayed independent for centuries. Once it was formed in the 7th, 8th century, it was not taken over by any colonial power, although the French tried it in the 20th century, and that's one of the things we'll talk about later. But here's an image of this dream of, quote, greater Morocco. There were some people in the early 20th century who thought that's what Morocco should look like. But as you see, here's what Morocco looks like now. Here's the disputed Western Sahara, which is more or less incorporated into Morocco now. But parts of Algeria, Mauritania, Mali, that was just a dream of some nationalists. We also mentioned Al-Andalus, Spain. And I mention it here just because, we're Westerners. And there's the greatest extent of the Muslim control over the Iberian Peninsula. Almost the entire peninsula, except for little parts of Galicia up here. And they extended into France. There were the two fundamentalist dynasties, the Almoravids, as you see here, 1040 to 1147, and the Almohads, 1120 to 1270. So this is their empire in that period. You see that they did control, in a way, parts of what's now Algeria, which is over here. And you also see how in Spain, Al-Andalus, what's called the Reconquista, the reconquest, of the Christians has been pushing the Muslims out by 1270. And some of you are aware that the final push comes in 1492. You have the establishment in Morocco of what's called the Alawite monarchy. It's a confusing name because there are the Muslims in Syria called the Alawites, who are not the same. I think they comes from, I see the descent from Ali. But anyway, that's the name of the monarchy in Morocco. And then finally, the last thing before we go into Algeria, I just mentioned what's called this Berber Dahir decree of 1930. And what the French tried to do is to divide the Berbers and the Arabs, they're all Muslims, in order to weaken this control of Islamic judges. And there are some scholars who say that this was the first catalyst, as I say here, and one of the central stages of Moroccan history, maybe. But it was very important for a Moroccan self-consciousness. Okay, well, let's go on to Algeria. We'll come back to Morocco again. Here's a map of northern Africa. Algeria is, I think, the largest country in Africa in landmass, although it's not the most populous. It's got about 45 million people now, but just all this down here is Sahara Desert down in the south. And if you look at the population density, you can see that people, the darker the color, the more the denser it is. So people are living along the coast, both in Algiers and Morocco. But here is this line right here is the border right now between the two countries. And very thin strip is the most densely populated across Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Well, where do the Arabs come from? Remember, we say that the natives of the area are Berbers. Someone asked me about what's the Berber religion before Christianity. I don't know the answer other than looked up animism of sorts. But anyway, the Arabs come in 7th to 8th centuries, and these Arab armies are very efficient. Remember, Islam initially is a warrior religion. They conquer lots of places. But the people who come in after the armies are urban elites. And then later on in the 11th to 12th centuries, we think there's somewhere up to 1 million immigrants who come from what's now Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And they are living, and as you see, the darker the color here is the more dense the population. It gets lighter and lighter as you go down into the desert for obvious reasons. And with the Arabs, you get a massive expansion of the Arabic language. Remember that the language of the Berbers is something called Tamazight, and it's just a different language. It's not, Arab is a Semitic language, and Tamazight has a bunch of variants, but they're called Hamitic. Those of you who know the Bible, that's the legacy of Noah, his sons, Shem, Ham. He had a Japheth too, but I don't know about any Japhethite languages. Anyway, the Arabs mix with the Amazigh in some parts. And then later, going into the 17th century, you get smaller waves. And then after 1492, when the Reconquista is triumphant, drives out the last Muslim, I don't know if you call it a kingdom, I guess, they come into North Africa. A lot of Muslims come in North Africa, and they are urbanized, highly educated. They add to the mix of the Arabs in North Africa. Now, the Muslims are not officially totally excluded from Spain until later, but 1492, a lot of them leave. And just to show you this once again, here's Algeria showing, that's a physical map. So the green areas are slightly higher. Here, these are the Atlas, continuation of the Atlas Mountains here. And then we go down to the lowlands of the desert. So the northern mountains, mainly Amazigh up here, here, and here. The coastal plains become Arabized, except for this area called Kabylia. I've mentioned Kabylia or Kabylie, I'm not sure what to call it. That's been a home for protest for centuries. It still is. I saw a video the other day where a spokesman saying we need to have our own Kabyle state.
Larry, where is that? Where's Kabyle?
Well, here's Algiers, and Kabylie is right in here in the mountain, but it's mountainous. We'll mention it again, right in there. It's also a home for Algerian nationalism later. The high plateaus, as I say, have Arabs, and down in Sahara, these are Bedouin, well, let's say Bedouin Arab tribes. I'm not sure how many Arabs, but the deep Sahara, mainly Amazigh. Some of you have heard of the Tuareg tribes. Maybe you drove a Volkswagen called Tuareg, it's supposed to come out of the desert. Anyway, they were down south. You may be familiar with the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. The Ottomans emerge, they defeat the Christians, eventually taking Constantinople in, 1453, and they become the dominant power in the Mediterranean for several centuries. From the 16th century, then they start declining in the 18th and 19th century, and the imperialist powers really take advantage of what was going on in the Ottoman Empire. So while the Ottomans are expanding, you see the collapse of Al-Andalus, and we have Spanish enclaves in North Africa. Remember the two cities of Ceuta and Melilla, which to 2026, are still Spanish possessions, these two cities. So I mentioned the kind of hypocrisy of the Spanish in saying, we want Gibraltar as part of Spain. They don't mention they've got these two cities that are surrounded by Morocco. Anyway, Charles V, the war emperor, attacks Algiers. 516 ships, that's a big navy. Here's a contemporary rendering of Charles V attacking Algiers.
What nation is Charles V?
He is the Holy Roman Emperor. The story of Charles V, what is it? He speaks French to his mistresses, Spanish to his advisors, and German to his horse. But he was in Europe considered a great warrior. He eventually retired from the emperorship in 1556, I think. Well, so the Ottomans, quote, control Algeria from the 16th century on. Well, control is a funny term with all these Berber tribes. They have some administrators and they do collect some taxes, but it's kind of autonomous. They have someone called the Bey, who was the viceroy. And what they do, though, is take over lots of agricultural land, and that's the source of their power. You get sharecroppers, Arabic-speaking peasants, but it's those Turkish officials who take over. And here's this, what they call the Regency of Algiers. And this pink and this dark brown, they're also more or less controlled by the Ottomans, but not Morocco. See here, the Alawites, they spell it differently here, but that's Morocco is in green. The Berbers in Algeria are subject, is that okay? Yeah. Are subject to what's called Maliki law. Remember we said in the first lecture that the Sharia is, Muslim law, but there are various schools of jurisprudence, many, and Maliki is the one that's dominant in North Africa, and it's a more tolerant form of Islam, say, than we think of the Salafis from Saudi Arabia, which are really hard line. But The Maliki is the dominant form in Algeria, and in some rural areas, once again, Kabylia, there's customary law. The differences in law very often are expressed in family matters. We'll see it again. Divorce, marriage, birth, inheritance. They become sort of important, well, they are important, as who controls those portions of society. Are we okay on the?
Well, you got a little loud.
Yeah,
so I
touch it.
turned it down a little bit.
Are we okay in the back? The Algeria did not have an equivalent of what that Dahir, that decree of 1930. So customary law is tolerated, not codified. So depending on who the local judges are, different things can happen. And we'll see some more of that. But Berber and Arab Muslims are officially treated the same. In practice, customary law can come in. You have tribal chiefs and various things going on. Under the Ottomans, you have relative economic prosperity for a while. They raised a lot of wheat. Remember, there's this image you sometimes get from the papers that Africa consists of nothing but the Sahara Desert. It's not true, especially in the north. There has been some good agricultural land, but then in the early 19th century, the periods of good harvest ended. They practice what's called dry farming, which means you wait for the rain to fall without irrigation. So if you get a period of drought, as they do now too in West Africa, it's a problem. So the wheat harvest starts to fail. And remember that problem of food also feeds the French Revolution of 1789 and the 1790s. A lot of that revolution starts with bread riots because there's the wheat harvest is failing all over the Mediterranean area. And there's political instability. The failure of harvest leads to problems that I say there's an 1805 pogrom against Jews in Algiers, and we'll see that the Jewish community plays a different role in Algeria, and just as in Europe, they are blamed for social ills when, like bad harvest or something. So there's a pogrom in 1805 in Algiers. The Europeans are interested in controlling North Africa. If you remember, Napoleon invaded Egypt. He didn't do very well there. He sort of escaped by himself, but they found the Rosetta Stone. But after the war, after the Napoleonic Wars, you have something called the Congress of Vienna. And here's a cartoon of the Congress of Vienna carving up Europe and North Africa. Can't identify. You have to look real closely. The caption says "the cake of kings," le gâteau de roi. And there is pressure on Algeria to pay indemnities because they are, quote, an outlaw state. So Algeria is under pressure from Europe. Why are they an outlaw state? We'll see in a minute that what we have are the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were pirates operating out of Morocco and Algeria for close to 2 centuries, and they really did dominate shipping. Here, that upper cartoon is sort of an image of the Barbary pirates. I'm amused by the colors and stuff. And all of those Ottoman regencies down here say it's okay in a way for the pirates because the Ottomans collect money from the pirates. And in some cases, the Europeans find it's easier to pay protection money than to fight the pirates. They do that too. So even though they're not officially the navy of the Ottomans, they do exert pressure. And you may remember when you took American history, there was Thomas Jefferson authorizes the war against the pirates. Even though Jefferson is against having an army and a navy, he does see that the U.S. should fight the Barbary pirates. And they do get eliminated mainly in the first decades of the 19th century. Not just the Americans, but the Americans were very much involved. For a while there, the Napoleonic Wars let those pirates continue, and France has what's called ransom diplomacy, that is, pay money and you'll be okay. But then in Algiers, in 1816, they bombard Algiers. So this is really the end of the reign of the Barbary pirates. Remember, the word Barbary comes from Berber. That's where we get the name. Goes back to the Greek for strangers. They were the barbarians. So the French don't want to pay tribute anymore. But then in 1830, and here's really where the colonial history of Algeria starts, France invades. Now, why do they do it? First of all, there's this famous incident in 1827 where the French consul is called to the Ottoman Bey, the head of the area, and demanding that France repay some money that they owe. And when the consul is recalcitrant, he gets slapped with a fly swatter. This is the famous fly swatter incident of 1827. And actually it takes the French 3 years to realize that they're insulted. But that's the excuse for the invasion. But King Charles X of France feels the need for legitimacy. There's his interest in Algeria, and then there's a revolution in France in 1830. If you recall, Charles X, there was first, after the Napoleonic Wars, the first king of France is Louis XVIII, then Charles X. Then there is this, what's called the bourgeois monarchy, whereas Charles X is kicked out and Louis Philippe becomes the king. And there's this notion of how do you expand the power of the country? There's this looking for treasures abroad and for power abroad. So when they send 37,000 troops, that's a lot of people to ferry across the Mediterranean. And even now, take more than that to conquer Greenland. There's heavy fighting. There's initially a French victory, and here's these famous uniforms of the French Zouaves. They like the color red in their uniforms. Some of these images I picked just because of the colorful nature of what's going on, but they are there fighting in North Africa. And what happens is the French first loot the local treasury. Remember, with it, you don't have to have banks. You have money in chests or whatever. They take it, and they initially control just the city of Algiers and a narrow coastal strip. In the interior, there are tribal confederations that oppose them. And now we get to one of the great heroes of Algerian history. His name is in Arabic, so it's spelled different ways, Abdelkader. Abdelkader is based in Kabylia. He is a Sufi leader. Remember, we talked about Sufism as a way of practicing Islam. It's not looked on with great favor by, say, the Saudi Arabian forms, but it is accepted in Islam. I'm not sure, he may have been a marabout, which is sort of a holy man. I don't remember now, I have to check that. But anyway, Abdelkader is a very effective military leader. He regarded himself as commander of the faithful. By the way, that's what the Moroccan king calls himself now, the commander of the faithful. So he appeals to the Muslim community, and what he promises is to set up a state that has justice and equity. And he got this reputation of a mujahid. I mean, these are words that we see now. The mujahideen are the, depending, either the fighters for nationalism or terrorists, depends who's defining them. But the mujahideen in Gaza and in Syria and in Saudi Arabia, he's a mujahid. And by 1834, he's got a little state in Western Algeria, and he has some support from the Sultan of Morocco. Not a lot, but some. So here is Algiers on the coast, and here is the area of Abdul Qadir's state, if you will. Remember, when you have a state, one of the things you do is levy taxes. So he's not universally popular. People don't want to pay taxes. Surprise. But that's his state for a short time, and the French are fighting him, and initially not very successful. But they start pushing him toward the west here, down here. This is called the Rif. It's interesting, in the 20th century, there's a major revolt in the Rif. And we'll talk about that. That's when the Spanish have a little bit of Morocco. But anyway, he eventually is pushed further and further west. He loses Moroccan support because the Moroccans are afraid of the French invading them, and he surrenders. He's put in prison and then sent into exile. His image stays as sort of a great man, but here is what I've done, written across the bottom here are translations of the 4 sections of this map. So on the left side, you have what we call the French conquest. They take Algiers first, then they have these victories of battles, 1843, and Lisli, that's a big battle, 1844, where the Abdul Qadir, I think, is captured there. Then he has the striped area is where Abdul Qadir led resistance. You see, it's all across these are highlands, plateaus, and the lower parts of the mountains. And there are some victories that they have. Then French, 1830 to 1835, here's Algiers. Here's what they're calling the Bougie, city of Beaune, and the city of Oran. Then 1835 to 1847, this whole area becomes French controlled. And then after 1848, they try to grab more of it. Actually, the expansion of Algeria is not really complete until 1956, on the verge of independence. And then colonial administration, they just show just what this map shows, see how they really do set up an administration. So these dotted lines are French departments, départements, and that's how the French try to control Algeria. Another infamous character, at least from my point of view, General Thomas Bugeaud, is the one who defeats Abdul Qadir. And he has a scorched earth policy. He's vicious. They destroy villages, they deport populations. One of the things that they do in a few cases, they drive all the local people into a cave and then asphyxiate them by shutting the cave and building fires. I mean, it's really vicious with Bugeaud. And here's another example. They disregarded customs and beliefs. For example, In Algiers, they cut a road through a couple of cemeteries. They convert the largest mosque to a cathedral church. Of course, if you want to say turnabout is fair play, the Muslims in an earlier period converted churches to mosques. So it's not as though everybody is a good guy. And here is Bugeaud. There's one case where they totally wiped out one tribe, just kill everybody. I mean, it's really a vicious campaign. And then, as I say, by 1847, the resistance had collapsed. It took, 17 years. It wasn't that the French didn't have just an easy time of it. And here are these, an image of these French soldiers marching in. And here is a map, that's what I was referring to a second ago, that shows the expansion of France in Algeria. And it, here's, they invade 1834, they have this, then they take more in 1840, and it goes on. You see the years there. And 1956 is here. So there's some disputes with Morocco over these latest things. We'll talk about some more about this French expansion. Why did the French want the Sahara Desert? Well, that's where they had their atomic testing down in there in the late, and in fact, even after Algerian independence, one of the things that the French retain is the right to test atomic bombs down there. Someone asked about, and this is interesting, the French Foreign Legion. Now, they're formed initially to fight in Algeria. Now, when you watch movies, they're this wonderful group. They're a bunch of criminals and gangsters, and they could be recruited to work for ICE, for example. I mean, what kind of people do you get who go on to be these freelance soldiers? I think, I mentioned ICE, but I think more likely, remember in Africa, the Wagner group, which were these private troops brought in, and here that's what the Foreign Legion is like. And these are images of soldiers of the Foreign Legion, and they home base is Algeria, although they fight in other places. But they're seen at this time a quick response force to Algerian unrest, and they get people from all over Europe. We know that the Germans, Spaniards, Italians, you see all that list there. And in post-World War II, they still exist. You get more Latin Americans, Africans, and Asians joining the troops. They're tough troops. We will talk some more, not today, but in a future class, about what's called the Battle of Algiers in 1957, which is really a major league outbreak in the fight for Algerian independence. And the French are considered particularly vicious, so are the Algerian fighters, but the Foreign Legion leads a lot of the French troops in Algiers. In Morocco, they also play a major role after 1912. Remember that I said Morocco stayed independent. In 1912, France declares a protectorate. Say they're not a colony, they say they're, quote, a protectorate. So they leave the Sultan, the king, in place, but they institute administrators who really control the place. And the Foreign Legion plays a major role in subduing tribal and Berber resistance, although they don't get involved in the administration as they did in Algeria. Well, looking back at that French War of Conquest, and just to look at some numbers, they think they killed up to 1 million Algerians out of that's 1/3 of the population. Here's an example of the siege of the city of La Goutte. The entire city is emptied of its population and driven into exile. So that's this policy of Bugeaud. Here's where Laguat is just inland. That image up top is the population being deported. So, as I say, entire tribes. Remember, the Berbers are not one unified item. There are many Berber tribes with many Berber dialects, although they can generally communicate. And I throw in here, just for interest, how colonial Algeria had the same flag that we associate with France. And here's how it's changed. Unfortunately, it's got white here too, doesn't show. But that crescent, which is often associated with Islam, is there, and green is the Islam color. What about Abdul Qadir? He didn't die, he was in exile. It's very interesting. He was released from jail in 1852 and he settled in Damascus. And he then, in 1860, there were times of attacks on Christians, he was instrumental in sheltering thousands of Christians against massacres. So he becomes a kind of a hero to the Christians after being in exile in Damascus. And I throw this out just because Abdul Qadir is such a major figure in Algerian history. So he's seen as a founding father of resistance. You know, in the mythology of independence, it opens a long struggle for independence, but in fact, you know, the nationalist revolt takes place in the 20th century. But he is a symbol of tolerance, justice, and Islamic faith. I mean, he remains true to his faith. And just to show you, here is a monument set up not too long ago in the city of Sidi Khada, and it says, "To the memory of the Emir Abdul Qadir, 1807 to 1883. So he's sort of like George Washington, if you will, the father of the independence movement. He was defeated in war, but he has a sort of moral authority. Well, that's the Muslim side. What about European immigration? After all, if you're familiar with Algeria, you know there was a significant European population. At the end of the 1830s, there are, you know, as I say here, 14,000 Europeans, 12,000 Muslims, and 6,000 Jews in Algiers area. That's end of the 1830s. And then the numbers start to climb. So by 1840, you have 100,000, and by 1872, almost 250,000 Europeans who have come to settle both in the cities and to take over farms, plus another 35,000 Algerian Jewish community. And then we have 1901, 340,000 Europeans, plus who migrated, plus the 355 who've been born there, plus the Jewish population. Yeah. Why? People are leaving Europe. They came to America too, you may have noticed. That is to say, there's a major population growth in Europe and it can't contain them all. So Algeria looked like a good place to go. That is, they could, if they were French, they could speak the language, although many of the newcomers were Spaniards or from Malta. So what's interesting is this, we're not dealing with that here, but with this population explosion in the 19th century. And, you know, in the United States, I've seen different numbers of how many people immigrated. I've seen numbers anywhere between 25 and 55 million people came to the United States in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So this is part of that. I mean, it's a good question, but we're not used to thinking in those terms. But by 1911, you have 752,000 in the census, and in 1954, almost 1 million French, I'll call them French Algerians because they have a separate status under the law. They're subject to a different civil status. Remember, we said civil status, birth, marriage, divorce, inheritance. Muslims are different from these people who are generally considered to be Catholic plus the Jewish community. So what happens is something that's instituted in the French Revolution. Personal status is considered something to be determined by the state. And we live in a country like that too. I mean, if you want to, you can get married any way you want here, but you need to have a marriage license, which is from the state. You can then have a religious ceremony. That imposition is considered hateful to Muslim and Berber customary law. They don't like that intervention of the state into the personal status of individuals, and that lasts all through the 19th and 20th centuries. They don't want to have that interference, and it is a point of contention. In addition to personal status, the French are grabbing their land. They dispossess many Algerian landowners. There's 40 years of French expansion from 1830 to 1870, and there were some tribes who submitted, but then they couldn't pay the tax, so they lost control of their property. I mean, this is a difficult situation. And then there's a famine in Algeria in the 1860s. There's an image of a family suffering, and so they lose more of their land. They can't pay their taxes. And then there's a revolt in 1871 where the tribes try to capitalize on the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Remember that in the late 1860s, or actually 1870, France and Prussia go to war. Napoleon III is the emperor, turns out to be a paper tiger, and this is the foundation of the German Empire, so the Germans march into France, and actually the new German emperor is crowned in Versailles in France, which is a bone in the throat of German nationalists. There is a revolt of a man by the name of El Mokrani. He's the second nationalist hero of the 19th century. We had Abdul Qadir in the 1830s and 40s. And then we have El Mokrani. He's also a Berber. He's centered in Constantine, which is in the east section of Algeria, and in Kabylie again. Still a hero. There's an Algerian stamp in modern Algeria of El Mokrani. And here's where the revolt, the gray areas are the revolt. Here's Algiers right here. Here's this eastern area into Kabylie, but it goes further down into an area called the Aurès. And I don't quite understand what happened here. I guess he had an alliance with some other tribes down there. But it's a real challenge to French control. And what happens is that there's a vicious response. Now, the local settlers are not nice guys. They've grabbed the land, and they form these militias. And the militias are involved in indiscriminate killings. Whether you are with El Mokrani or not, I'm going to get you and grab the land. I mean, it's, I don't know, killing people just because they're there. The settlement includes an enormous indemnity that the tribes had to pay. They can't afford it. More land gets confiscated. So you're really driving these Berber populations into poverty. This is accelerated after 1870. Here's a statue dedicated to El Mokrani, 2021, in Kabylie, of course. But my point is, just as El Qadir is still celebrated, El Mokrani is still celebrated. I mean, we have it here. We have our statues to George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. The European settlers, as I said, are mainly urban, and they get this name of colons, meaning colonists, or pieds noirs, black feet. It's not a derogatory term. I've read various explanations. I don't know why they're called pieds noirs. But they rely heavily on Muslim agricultural labor. They may own the farms, but they're looking for these workers. And, as I say, they rely on that labor to build up the farms. So it's not as though all the colonists were rich, but they certainly were in a privileged position in Algeria. Here's that old issue of personal status. I want to mention it again because that's a sticking point for the Muslims. Pre-1830, the Muslims had Islamic law, but from 1830 to 1962, Muslims still have Muslim personal status, and the French use that as an excuse for not granting citizenship. Well, if you're going to have Muslim personal status, then you're not going to be a French citizen, and the Muslims don't want to be French citizens if they have to give up their rights under Muslim law. So the settler population, the colons, the pieds noirs, are subject to French civil law. The Jews have, and the Christians too, something called the dhimmi status. Some of you may have heard of. Dhimmi means subordinate position, but it's a protected position. So there is in this case, a Jewish community, not much of a Christian community, but and they're rabbinical courts, so they have their own personal status issues. So they also are not interested in becoming necessarily part of the majority. But in 1870, a man named Adolphe Crémieux was the Minister of Justice, and there is what's called the Crémieux Decree, where French citizenship is granted to Jews in Algeria, and French civil law replaces rabbinical courts. So this gives automatic citizenship, certainly to the Sephardic Jews in Algeria. And as you might imagine, this drives a division between the Muslims and the Jews. So all of a sudden, the Jews in Muslim eyes become associated with the dominant pieds noirs. And it's not, that heritage isn't very good for the Jews in the long run. So in contrast to the Jews, Muslims and foreigners have to be at least 21 to apply for French citizenship. Very few Muslims get it. And as I said, the long-term consequences for Muslim-Jewish relations are not very good. Agriculture, what do the French do there? We looked at this last week. Wheat, barley, and oats are grown. And they have, as I mentioned, dry farming, meaning waiting for the rain to come. In the Sahara, not much grows. And in the mountains, the Berbers are still there maintaining their traditions. But one thing that the French introduce is grape growing. So Algerian wines become very important. And then late in the 19th century, there's an epidemic called phylloxera, and it hits France and it hits Algeria. It wipes out many of the vineyards. So all of a sudden, it's not just the Berbers who are suffering, but everybody who is dependent on the wine, on the grapes and the wine, are in trouble from the phylloxera. Here's an image of grape growing in Algeria before the phylloxera epidemic. The Berbers also maintain in the mountains. They maintain their flocks, the traditional, not agriculture, but farming. Well, who owns the land? After 1830, we think there are about 2,200 individual farms, and they continue on. But in 1962, and I'm jumping ahead because it's still important for this, all cultivable land is owned by the state. Algeria defines itself as a socialist republic. It's got a lot of similarity to the Russian-controlled states of Eastern Europe after 1945. And if you will, collectivization of agriculture is one of them. So after 1987, they started to sell off some of the collective farms, but the government still owns 1/3 of the cultivable land in Algeria. So that's just a hint of what we'll be seeing when we talk about modern Algeria. Yeah.
So, could you, 1962, all cultivable land owned by state. How does that come about?
By collectivizing the farms.
Who does that?
The government. The 1962 is the official date for the beginning of independent Algeria. And although there's a lot of infighting among the nationalist movements, the people who are in charge take over all of agriculture. Of course, they're kicking out a lot of French farmers too. We'll see that something like 1 million people emigrated from Algeria in 1962. We'll talk about that exodus in another lecture. So, as I mentioned, the colonists are on the coast. They're mainly Roman Catholic. And here is an image of the non-Muslim population of Algeria. So if it's black in these urban areas, that's more than 30%. Then as you see, blue is 5 to 10%, aqua 2 to 5%, and white, hardly any non-Muslims. So that's this. Of course, the country goes way down here. So this is the interior, the coastline and the high plateaus and the low mountains. So here's the Muslim population compared to the Pieds Noirs. In 1830, as I mentioned, we have 14,000 Pieds Noirs. Pieds Noirs is a new term, but let's use it. It sort of tells us who they are. As opposed to 1.5 million Algerians, as you remember also that a lot of Algerians were killed in that war. But all over Europe and North Africa, you have an incredible population growth. So by 1851, 2.5 million, 1960, 10 million Muslims, 1965, almost 12 million. And if you compare that to the Pieds Noirs, in 1959, we see 1,111,000 according to the census of 1959. And then the Great Emigration in 62, 63, leaving perhaps 100,000, if that many, in Algeria. There's something that's set up by the government called the code. I don't even know how to pronounce it. I mean, how to translate it. Code de l'Indigène, of the Code for the Indigenous Peoples, meaning the Muslims, set up in 1881. And what it is a set of discriminatory laws imposed on the natives of French colonies. And it creates an inferior legal status, and it's punishment without normal procedures. So here is a newspaper attack. They say, Anatomy of a Legal Monster. Colonial law in Algeria and in the French Empire. This is sort of an attack on that code. Let's call it indigenous code, if you will. And here is, just to give an example, that the translation is the causes of administrative internment of the indigenous peoples up to 1914 in 2 departments. And as you see, okay, 39% regular crimes, but 19% insecurity and marginality. What does that mean? You're poor, homeless perhaps, you get arrested for that. 14% made the pilgrimage to Mecca without being authorized. This is and then opposition to state authority, whatever that means. And so on, land and forest conflicts, 4%. So the point of this chart is to suggest how this code of the indigena is enforced against the local population. It's very difficult to have any brush with, to triumph in any brush with the law for the Muslims. Well, World War I. This is part of France. That's what France says. Well, if you live in France, then you're subject to the draft. And we get about 173,000 Muslim Algerians serving in the French army. A lot of them, well, willingly. They didn't, there's no draft revolt, certainly. And we think about 25,000 Algerians were killed. And the regiments have the mainland French with the Algerians in them, but they don't get treated the same. In Algeria, when you take all these people out, there's a labor shortage. Creates an economic strain, and families losing their breadwinners because it's the men and young sons who leave. Some people get state pensions, but French get paid more than the Muslims. Not that the French did so great, but they did a lot better than the Muslims. There are some vague promises of reform, but not much. And so you get beginnings of nationalist feelings. And then very briefly, because we'll talk about this again in another class, between the two world wars, there's this so-called law that gives limited political rights to a small group of what they call evalués, evolved. That is, they've gotten an education in French, they own property, but it's a relatively small percentage. It might be up to maybe 10% of eligible Muslims. Europeans are full citizens. Here's a great image they like of downtown Algiers. It's really, the climate's pretty nice. The Muslims are 90% of the population are subject to that code with economic and political authority held by the Pieds Noirs. And here's the Kasbah, which is the Arab quarter. It's really run down. I mean, it's a lot of poverty among the Arab population, Arab and Berber.
Where did the Jews stand in this? Were they full citizens under that?
Under the Crimea decree, yes, they are kind of. We'll see in a minute what happens here. Because in 1936, Léon Blum, the French prime minister, and a minister named Violette, suggested giving French citizenship to just a small number of Algerian Muslims without requiring renunciation of their personal status. It's rejected. There's no desire to do anything of the sort. And that title of that French newspaper says, Mr. Violette explains his plan that France should recognize the right to vote for the indigenous population of Algeria does not pass. In World War II, Algerians are mobilized once again, maybe 170,000 Muslims, although initially they support the Vichy regime. Remember that France is partially occupied for 2 years before the Nazis take over the whole country, and the Vichy regime retains the loyalty at first of the army. These are Algerian soldiers arriving in France at the beginning of the war. Then when Vichy takes over, in answer to Margaret's question, they abolish the Crimea decree. So Jews no longer have that equality, and they reinforce racial segregation between Europeans and Muslims, and the Nazis would have liked to round up the Jews. Unfortunately, they were not able to. Algerian political activity was repressed, and then in 1942, you have what's called the Operation Torch, where French and British land in Algeria. And at first the Vichy army opposes them, but then they move over. And this is just a suggestion of these two tribes. Here's Algeria into Tunisia, Americans and British. And you're probably familiar with a lot of movies about this war in North Africa. We're not going to be discussed some other time. If you watch the movie Casablanca, you have these refugees, you know, the police. I just watched it the other night again. You can get it on YouTube. The local police chief is at first loyal to Vichy, and he butters up the visiting Germans, but then they change sides. Algeria then becomes the capital of Free France. De Gaulle sets up his headquarters in Algeria. Algiers, you know, sends out, eventually gets there. And then 1945, and this is something we'll talk about again, there are demonstrations for Algerian independence, and Algerians are massacred. Large numbers are killed. And I'll give you more detail of that in another class. But that's where I'm going to stop, where somehow I have to write to 12 o'clock, amazing. Yes, Rick.
What worthwhile literature, if any, arose from any of these cultures, either Moroccan or Algerian, over all these periods?
Well, one example.
Hebrew, Arab.
Could you, for the purposes
Yeah,
of
well,
the
the
video-
question was, what kind of literature arose either among the Arab or French populations? Well, the most famous writer is Albert Camus, and his books, The Stranger, The Plague, these are all set in North Africa. There are, actually, it's now become popular in France to write novels referring to this situation in the history there, but they're in French. So I have written down, I have them on top of my head, but they've won some prizes. It's after 12, let's take one or two questions and then you can talk to me afterwards.
I know it's not our subject, but how do the French imperialists compare to the other empires that are being created over this period?
It's an interesting question. The French, they're tough. I mean, well, it depends where. In Indochina, they're just making money hand over fist. But the British seem to have a better record of setting up judicial systems. The Germans are very strict in control of the population, and the image of the Belgians is the gallows. So there are differences among the different groups, which is not part of our subject here, and it's already after 12. So if you have questions, I'll be glad to talk to you afterwards. But I think it's fair we should stop.